All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Joëlle Fearsley. I am the co-founder and CEO of Tribute, a responsible retail and a cross-disciplinary platform based in Washington, D.C. Welcome to The Good Chat. So The Good Chat is a fairly new endeavor for us. It started in May 2020. As an aftermath of the COVID-19, we wanted to continue to create thoughtful and intentional conversation on fashion, the same ones we had in our space before. We wanted to continue to encourage critical thinking and to continue to engage with our community. So we decided to go virtual. And today I am delighted to kick off the first Good Chat of the year with 4 wonderful panelists that join us today to talk about fashioning DC. In November 2020, we launched a project called Untold, a style anthology of Washington, D.C. It's a research project that brings together art, photography, storytelling, and fashion. It's a mural painted by Chelsea Ritten Sororen on Columbia and 17th Street in Adams Morgan, and it's an ongoing photo exhibition on view in our space. With Unfold, we decided to dive into the untold history of fashion in the capital and how it has evolved over time. We look at the main player, the one who contributed to build a scene in the capital, and the one who are today using fashion as a means to carve out a space for the articulation of identity, self-belonging, and cultural belonging. So to fully understand, I'm very pleased to have today Elizabeth Way, Nancy Davis, Jason Barnes, and Farrah Skeiky here with us this evening to share their research, their work, and their thoughts, and get some sense of who were and who are the main contributors to DC fashion. Where does fashion exist in DC and how it is articulated? I know it's a really extensive topic, so we'll do our best to cover the important points in 45 minutes. And before we start, just some quick housekeeping to our participants. Sorry, I'm still admitting people. To our participants, please, I will ask you to remain muted throughout the discussion. You can chat, comment, and ask a question in the chat box. If you want to ask your question live, please mention it in your comments, and we have assigned some time at the end of the discussion to answer them. The discussion will be recorded and uploaded later on our YouTube page, which I invite you to subscribe to. And I'm going to share the link now with all of you. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. And without any further ado, I will let each panelist introduce themselves and their work, and then we'll dive deeper into the subject. Nancy, shall we start with you?
Sure. I'm Nancy Davis, and I am a curator emeritus at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution. And though I retired a couple of years ago, I'm still pretty active in the museum when I can get into the museum. And we're not open at the present time, but it's still an opportunity for me to continue to collect and to work within the collection, what we call the costume collection at the American History Museum.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Way, and I'm an assistant curator at the museum at FIT in New York. Like Nancy, we haven't been in our collection since March, but we've been continuing to work. We do a lot of books, so that's been something that's we've been able to focus on. In my personal research, I look at the intersection of African-American culture and fashion, and I especially look at a lot at Black dressmakers. So that was something that I was introduced to through an internship at the Smithsonian in DC, and that I've been able to continue in my personal work.
Thank you. Farrah?
Hi there, my name is Farrah Skeiky. I'm a photographer in DC, and I mostly focus on movement and movements, especially subcultures like hardcore punk, like drag, and lately during this pandemic, a lot of community organizing and mutual aid. I've just been on the other, I've been on one side of the camera for a really long time, and it's allowed me to take everything in as far as where trends might be starting, where trends are being completely ignored, and that's been a really exciting place to be, to kind of soak it all in and put it all together.
And last but not least, Jason.
Hi, my name is Jason Barnes, also known as Pussy Noir. I'm a performance artist that also involves drag in DC. I've actually been shot by Farrah many times. And I'm also a fashion historian. I have a fashion history podcast called The Beauty RPO. We discuss history through the context of fashion with a lot of comedy and a lot of shade thrown on historical figures. And I would just like to say, Nancy and Elizabeth, before I lose the chance, I wish I had your jobs, because that sounds like, for me, that is the big history nerd's dream of what you guys do. But yeah, I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to have this discussion. I was just here for the food, but now I'm here for the discussion.
Thank you. So just quickly to repeat for everyone who just joined us, we will have some time for questions at the end of the conversation. So if you have any questions, please send them to Tribute Collective in the chat box. So yeah, let's start. So basically the main question, the way it's gonna go, I really have 3 or 4 main questions. One, who made a contribution to DC fashion? How did they do it? And what is happening now also? Where does fashion exist in Washington, D.C., and how is it articulated? So Elizabeth, I would like to start with you. I know that you've done a lot of research on Elizabeth Keckley, and I'm not going to introduce her, so I will let you introduce her. Who is she, and what has she done? And I'm also curious to know, why did you decide to focus your research on her?
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I put in the headphones just to cut down on ambient noise because I'm hearing some things in my apartment. Elizabeth Keckley is really a remarkable human being. She was born enslaved in Dinwiddie County, Virginia in 1818. And she started sewing and dressmaking. She learned the skills from her mother. She started 4 or 5 years old. She was making not only kind of clothes that other enslaved people in her community wore. She was making really high-end fashion inspired by French trends in the 19th century. And so she wasn't just a home sewer. There are many, many women in the 19th century who were very skilled seamstresses who could sew, but she was really, on the professional level, a dressmaker. And throughout her life, she moved with the family that owned her, who was also her father. She moved to North Carolina, Hillsborough, North Carolina, and then she ended up in St. Louis, Missouri. And at that point, throughout this time, she'd been making dresses not only for her own family, but for outside clients. Her owners would hire her out. She was able to keep some of her pay, but she just built up a reputation. And not only was she great at making clothes, she was great at networking and creating these client networks. So by the time she was in St. Louis, the woman who owned her was her half-sister, who was married to a lawyer, but he found himself out of work. And at one point, Elizabeth Keckley was supporting the entire family, about 17 people, with her dressmaking work. She was very much in demand. She freed herself by taking out a loan from all of these white women, these dressmaking clients in St. Louis. They loaned her about $1,200 to free her and her son because they liked her. They trusted her and they wanted to support her. So she bought her freedom, and she stayed in St. Louis, made enough money to pay all of them back, and then moved to DC in about 1860. At that point, Verena Davis, who was Jefferson Davis's wife, was the most important socialite. Kind of the Southern women were really kind of the most popular ones at that point, right before Mary Todd Lincoln came into town. And Verena Davis hired her, several other really prominent women related to Robert E. Lee, related to, like, you know, the Secretary of State. All the elite kind of women became clients of Elizabeth Keckley. And she started again. She, you know, she had built up this client network in St. Louis, and she started again from scratch in Washington, D.C. But she was really able to talk to people to build these networks. I think that was as important as her kind of technical skill and her artistic talent. So on the recommendation of Verena Davis, kind of through her reputation, she was recommended to Mary Todd Lincoln, and she became Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker. And not only a dressmaker, she was actually a quite close friend of Mary Todd Lincoln. And the reason we know about her is because she wrote a memoir. Elizabeth Keckley learned not only to sew from her mother, but she also learned to read and write. So I'm sure there are many other really skilled, really important enslaved and Black dressmakers in the 19th century, but we don't know their stories. Fortunately, she was able to she was able to preserve her story in this wonderful memoir, which is actually a huge resource for anyone studying Abraham Lincoln or Mary Todd Lincoln, because there's like firsthand accounts of her life in the White House. She was also an abolitionist. So she was a really kind of amazing figure. But at this point in history, we don't have kind of the media that we have now, or even this idea of celebrity has changed slightly. It's definitely growing in the 19th century, but women like Mary Todd Lincoln, other prominent women in DC were really important fashion icons. Mary Todd Lincoln was criticized and kind of scrutinized for her fashion throughout her term as First Lady. So Elizabeth Keckley was making clothes that were being seen on a national scale. These would have been kind of engraved in newspapers, reproduced through illustrations, but also seen within that elite circle in Washington, D.C. and setting trends. So even though we don't think of kind of the American fashion system in the mid-19th century the way we do at the early 20th century, she was definitely kind of creating these fashion images that were circulating. And these were things that were coming from Paris. Paris was definitely kind of influencing American fashion at this time, but she was making a real contribution to the way American women dressed and the way they wanted to look.
And what would you say, so back in the so going back to, like, she was dressing the First Lady of the US. So in terms of legacy, what would be her legacy as someone who had a first, like, as a First Lady dressmaker?
Well, her aesthetic legacy is kind of amazingly still extant. The American National Museum of American History owns 2 dresses made by her, one for Mary Todd Lincoln, one for another woman who was the wife of an official who her family donated the dress and attributed it to Elizabeth Keckley. There's a couple of pieces that we think are made by Elizabeth Keckley that belong to Mary Todd Lincoln in Chicago, and a couple of other pieces scattered around the country. And so not very much, but the fact that we have these extant garments, that they survived and we're able to trace them back to her, is very, very rare when it comes to not just Black dressmakers, but like 19th century dressmakers, American dressmakers in general. There's not a ton that we can positively identify, because, you know, people didn't label their clothes in the same way. People didn't keep records, and people recycled fabric and dresses. They made them into other things. So the fact that these things survive is a huge part of her legacy. But also, you know, she was a woman who was able to transform her labor from enslaved labor into free labor. She owned a business in DC. She employed other women. She trained other women. She founded an abolitionist organization to raise money to help newly free people. She was a professor at Wilberforce University in Ohio later in her life. So she really has this kind of extensive legacy, even beyond her contribution to fashion.
Mm-hmm. And I would say a legacy as a contribution to African American fashion in the US too, right?
Absolutely. So several images of her survive. I think we can make a fair assumption that she perhaps made the clothes that she's wearing. But even just the figure of her as someone who is visible in society, a Black woman who's visible in society at that time, was very, very rare. So she definitely had a huge impact on the African American community in DC. She was kind of a socialite within that community. And yeah, just the fact that she's a prominent person, we have images of her, we have the words that she wrote, that's really important for African American history.
And why did you decide to study her, to focus your work on her?
So when I was in I went to NYU for graduate school, but my parents live in Southern Maryland. So for my summer intern, I wanted to be close to home just for logistical reasons. And I was very lucky to get an internship at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this is before they had a building. So we were like on Maryland Avenue in an office building. But my job was to go through the archives of the Black Fashion Museum, which was founded in the late 60s in Harlem. And that collection kind of moved through different hands and was acquired by the Smithsonian. So I was one of the first researchers to kind of go through these papers and do some initial research on the people that were prominent in that collection. And that's when I discovered Elizabeth Keck. They'd never heard of her before. Also another dressmaker who worked in the 1950s and 60s named Anne Lowe, who was famous for making Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding dress. But I discovered these two dressmakers and I was completely fascinated by their stories, and I ended up writing my master's thesis on them. And then since then, I've continued to research them and published a few articles and things on them, and I've really found it to be a really rich source of kind of research and study for my professional life.
Yes, yeah, I think her story is fascinating. I mean, that's really how we started to work on our on Unfold, on the research project that we have. It's really her. She was the beginning of everything. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and that research. So we can read your paper. Your paper is available for everyone to read online, right?
It's through a research journal called Fashion Theory. So if you have access to a university library, that it should be available there. But Elizabeth Keckley's memoir is digitized and available online for free through an organization called South Doc. But if you Google her name and her memoir, you'll be able to read her actual words, which is really great.
Yes, I've read it, and it's wonderful to read it, and to also I've listened to it too. It's a podcast too. You can find it. I was driving to New York from Washington, and it's wonderful because she kind of also described DC, and she described the White House, so it brings you back in time. And yeah, it's a wonderful book. Nancy, were you able to see that purple dress in the museum?
Oh yes, it's interesting because I was just looking at it today. And, we have also a christening gown that supposedly she made for her goddaughter. And so that is something that I really love. It's a very sweet and simple christening gown. And I was just looking at the other gown today because someone was interested in it. And, as you say, Elizabeth, it's so hard to be sure that she had her hand on that, but it's something that's quite lovely and very interesting to take a look at that and try to figure that out.
Yeah, I feel you're emotional talking about it.
Yeah, wonderful.
So Nancy, can you talk to us? I will ask you the same question. Who, according to you, made a contribution to fashion in DC? And please share your fascinating research with all of us.
Sure. Well, one of the people that I highly respected was Nina Hyde, who was a wonderful fashion editor for the Washington Post for a great deal of time. She was the Post fashion editor from 1972 to 1990, so a really long time. But one of the things that I really look back on with great fondness was the opportunity to take a class with her. She did teach material culture classes at George Washington University, where I attended, and she was so irreverent. She was very funny, and she had great stories about designers because she worked with Bill Blass, and she worked with Calvin Klein, and she worked for Diana Vreeland, and she would just wonderfully drop these names into the class and chat about them and talk about them. And I just found her such a very down-to-earth person. And of course, one of the great things for Elizabeth is that the Nina Hyde collection is at the FIT library. So it's not in Washington, D.C. It is actually with you, Elizabeth. And I have to say that sometime when it's open again, I'd like to go and take a look because I've always found her so wonderful. But one of the things I really liked about Nina Hyde was that she wrote about fashion as sort of social history she was really expansive in the way she thought about fashion and the way she kind of cataloged it. And she was really interested, and I thought this was really fascinating, she was really interested in the development of punk. And, you know, that was something that we didn't talk a whole lot about in the 1970s. And she was really interested in it. And I also think, and I was thinking about Tribute, because one of the things that I loved about her was that she was really into secondhand stuff. She was really interested in yard sales. She would go from yard sale to yard sale, and she was really about sustainability. And she would find something in a yard sale, something she really liked, and then she would just wear it for you know, 3 days on end. She just was so into purchasing secondhand things and really into responsible fashion. And she also worked as a freelancer for National Geographic, which meant that she was able to travel around the world, and she was very much aware of world trends and world activities and world fashion. And so she brought that sort of liveliness into the class. And I always loved the way she approached things, because she was a very outgoing extrovert, and she would just go up to people on the DC streets and ask them about what they were wearing and why they were wearing it, and then she would write about it in the paper. And you know, it was always so much fun, because you never knew what you might hear in the class, because she would just have so much fun just chatting with people. I'm sure some people were a little amazed to be asked about, so why are you wearing those boots? So what's that with the hat? And then she would write about it. So I just think that she was a really wonderful person. And, you know, fashion designers and designers just loved her, because she was so ebullient and so irreverent, and so had such a great sense of humor. So I think that her contribution to DC fashion is one of those very special things that I look back on with great fondness.
Mm-hmm.
So
I had no idea we had street style kind of interviews in DC. I wish we can, maybe someone can revive that.
Yeah. Pretty wonderful. You need a special kind of person to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, now it's hard because not a lot of people are walking.
Right.
And loungewear is what everyone is wearing. But
Right.
we'll discuss more about the punk scene with Farrah later. But I want you to also talk a little bit about what you're doing, about the exhibition that you put together, Many
Mm-hmm.
Voices, One Nation, and how also that is that work is informing also the identity in Washington D.C., but also as a bigger American identity.
Yeah, well, the exhibition Many Voices, One Nation is that American history, and it looks at first I sort of gulped when we talked about this, but it is actually 500 years of how people negotiated together, both, you know, together in concord and often in real conflict. But this looks at the migration and immigration of people that came to the United States through the interrogation of about 300 or more objects. And so this exhibition opened in 2017, took about 7 years to work on. And I was the exhibition director for this, but there were 12 or 13 curators involved in the research, and they were actually not just from American history. They were from the Museum of African American History, they were from Natural History Museum, and from the Museum of American Indians. So it was a really wonderful opportunity to work with curators looking at collections across the institution. The exhibition will be up for 20 years, so you will have a chance to see it. But what's happened with that is that because there are a fair number of objects of fabric and clothing, it does change and rotate quite frequently. So there are always new things to take a look at. But there is a lot of multimedia. There are about 8 multimedia videos and interactives. But really my interest in this exhibition sort of stemmed from a research interest in recording stories and collecting objects relating to immigration and migration. And so that's really why I felt so drawn to this exhibition, and so really loved the opportunity to pull this all together. But I will say it's a pretty extensive timeline and challenging to do that. But one of my favorite parts of the exhibition is called the Heritage of Dress case, which changes about every other month and allows us to really investigate some of the newer collecting that we're doing on migration and immigration. And that has been really fascinating. And so that's really what my work has been for the last 12 years or so.
Thank you, Nancy. For the interest of time, I have so many questions already for both of you, but we're going to go to Farrah. Hi, Farrah.
Hello. Okay, cool.
Farrah, can you have the same question? Again, according to you, who is making a contribution to the DC fashion scene? And please talk a little bit about your work and how you're exploring the punk scene, which Nancy mentioned, which existed, I guess, since the 70s in DC.
Mm-hmm. In my humble opinion, every band that has stayed on a couch in DC has contributed to fashion in this city as far as punk is concerned. Punk is simultaneously about collecting and exclusivity, while it's still about sharing information, right? If a band has a limited number of t-shirts with them on tour, you're not going to be able to, at least for the most part, especially in the 70s and the 80s, you weren't going to go on their merch store later and buy the shirt that you missed out at the show. If you didn't buy it from them, on the rec center couch that night, you weren't going to have it, and people would hoard them also. Like, the joke is one to rock and one to stock, like one that you'll wear and one that you'll keep in like mint condition in your closet for the rest of your life. So while that exclusivity is going on, you also have a lot of exchange of ideas in the form of trading tapes, making compilations of music that's being made in your town. Even to this day, you'll find like a DC punk compilation from like recent years, from like 2015 onwards, things like that, and through zines. And DIY, like do-it-yourself zines, are really how people learn more about what other punks are doing on the other side of the country and other parts of the world. There's publications that have been, there's publications like Maximum Rock and Roll, which is very much a magazine, but is printed in a very zine format. It's still on newsprint to this day, and it's the longest running punk zine like in the history of punk. It's been around forever. It's run by like a cooperative of people in the Bay Area of California. And myself, when I got into punk, when I got from getting into, I don't know, like David Bowie, and I was starting to listen to like Joy Division and Black Flag because my friend gave me some CDs. It was an issue of Maximum Rock and Roll at the record store that got me into punk. On the cover, there was a Japan scene report, and I was like, these Japanese punks dress way cooler than any punks I've ever seen in America. So this exchange of ideas in that way is huge. And the idea is that, well, punks need to do it ourselves, because if anybody else does it, it's making a spectacle out of us instead of sharing the ideas. So when you think about, I think when in mainstream culture, when you think about punk fashion and punk contribution, it is very like Betsy Johnson, like rocker chic prom dresses. It is very like tartan and manic panic. And that is very much one kind of punk fashion. The biggest misconception people have about it is that it's not a monolith, right? It changes by region. It also changes based on the kind of punk that you listen to. So there are folks who are all black, dirty shirts, boots with chains and things like that. But there are also folks in certain subgenres of punk that look like jocks. And these are people who tell me, I wish your photos were in color so I could see what color sneakers that guy has on, because there's an intersection of even sneaker culture in punk too. So it's a little bit of everything. And especially in DC punk specifically is a place where you could be a punk with a 9 to 5 and maybe you worked late, you got to the gig wearing your work clothes. Nobody's going to give you a hard time for it because everybody just kind of gets it. Like, this is very much a city where even within the punk scene or the punk community, everybody kind of does their own thing. There are trends within it, but you're not going to be shunned because you're not following a trend, and you're not going to be shunned because you're not dressing punk. Because again, for us, a lot of the time it feels like the notion of dressing punk might be to put on a costume. In pretty much any punk community, any punk scene, if there are those people who dress in the kind of stereotypical mainstream notion of what it is to dress punk, those are people who are doing it every single day. It's not a matter of one day I'll dress a little more 70s Sex Pistols style, and then this week I'm going to dress like I'm an 80s band from DC. Like, usually people just do their own thing and maybe their style evolves, but it really, there's a big discouragement as far as putting on a costume, because then it brings into question the authenticity. So the most important thing to me about DC punk and DC punk fashion is just being true to yourself, because people are smart, kids are smart, the youth are smart, and if you're bullshitting, they're very aware of it. If they feel like you're putting on a facade and trying to be somebody that you're not, putting on airs, that is the least fashionable thing that you could do. Kind of wearing whatever you feel like and owning it is like the most punk thing you could do.
So I have this question. I have a question, which is, when you started looking at the punk scene, where did you go? How did I start? Where did you know where to go to find those kids?
Yeah, I mean, I was those kids to a certain degree. I am still those kids. It wasn't so much that I was, on the hunt for my new cool subject. It was very much that this is kind of what I grew up in. When I was 15, my family moved from Seattle, which was a very cool city to be a teenager, to Montgomery County, Maryland. I was not excited about it because Montgomery County, Maryland, Burtonsville, Maryland was not exciting to me. The idea of walking 20 minutes to get to a bus to get to the end of the red line was not exciting to me. But the proximity to like punk in DC, especially DC, is a place where all ages shows are not the norm in other cities. Like, Seattle is a city where to this day, even if the show is 21 and up, they can charge you $5 more at the door if you're under 21, because they're not making an alcohol sale off of you. So a lot of the time they just don't bother. So to be in a city that is inclusive of every age and makes that a safe place to be was really exciting to me. So I've been going to those concerts since I moved here. I've been going to those shows since I moved here. I now live a block away from St. Stephen's Church in Mount Pleasant. I have been coming to concerts there since I first moved to DC. So and it's nice to walk by it every morning and think about the first time I was in there and how big and intimidating it was to be the new kid in a scene where I didn't know everybody. But I got to enter that space and be myself. So I just kind of grew up in it here. It wasn't something that I had to seek out, because it was the only thing that made me happy about moving to this area was the legacy of really amazing music and all ages shows that happened here, and the community ethos that went along with it. Like, most of the shows I've gone to in DC are not shows where bands are collecting money at the door. They're benefit shows. So a lot of the ethos in punk is just looking out for each other, because you're not depending on a bigger entity to do it. You're not depending on the government to maybe take care of your little community or this issue that's happening in your neighborhood, but you can rely on your friends and the bands. And for that reason, a lot of the time, fashion is not the priority. So it's funny to sometimes think about punk being this big force in fashion, where the people who are making punk music for the most part on an underground level don't really super care. That's weird.
But it's a way for them to express themselves through the music and to meet and to. Did you, through your exploration, also were you interested, or are you interested in exploring other subcultures in DC?
Yeah, I've been spending more and more time over the years in the alternative drag scene, which is exciting, which is how I know Jason and how I've come to photograph Jason several times, which I feel very lucky to have done. The honor is all mine. And that's because I was in a band where our front person is a drag queen.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an all queer hardcore band. And it was, you know, sometimes we would play shows that were benefit shows where it would be band, drag queen. And those lineups were always my favorite and the most fun for me. And it's interesting to see the intersections of all these subcultures. Like, you have a lot of young punks in DC who work in art or visual art, and maybe they're working in gallery jobs for their first time, things like that. The trends kind of bleed into each other. And again, like, this is another place where punk kind of just makes room for people to be themselves. Like, there's punks with Telfar bags right now because Telfar bags are trendy everywhere. And, you know, it's not even a situation where somebody might, oh wow, oh, you got a fancy bag, oh, you think you're cool, you think you're fancy. No, it's just like, oh, that person's doing them, they're doing their own thing. But I think it's because, you know, it's no one who is part of punk is just a punk. Like, we all have other aspects of our lives, and the social circles we run in are not exclusively punk. What we do for work is not exclusively punk, so other influences are going to come in, and I think that is shown in like how easily it is for those different subcultures to kind of come together, like art gallery kids, punks, drag performers. The lines are nicely blurring a little bit right now, and that's very exciting to me.
Yeah, I guess that's what I loved about moving to DC, is actually discovering those different scenes, and discovering them through time with meeting one person and the other. And Jason, I met Jason, and then I discovered that underground drag scene through him too. So Jason, the question goes to you right now. Who, according to you, made a contribution to the DC fashion scene? And then if you can just talk more about the drag queen scene here, and the art and your art, the performance art that you've been doing. That would be great.
So the lineup in which we just spoke actually works really well with what I'm going to say. But I would say the people that have established a DC style or fashion scene, to me, it's a salad. It's a mixed salad of people. We kind of, and to a certain degree, touch on all those people. I'll go back really far and say, I think about the story of Dolly Madison, the First Lady, where, you know, the famous story is when the White House was on fire, she saved the drapes. And, you know, we kind of always stop at she saved the drapes and that's it. And it's kind of funny, but it actually speaks to a lot. So Dolly Madison wasn't just saving the drapes, she was saving her establishment of power and communication in DC. And because of her, we get the establishment of sartorial power on the Hill. So this idea of just enough, looking powerful but not extravagant, looking clean, looking put together, all those elements that we kind of usually, in my opinion, discard in the high art of the fashion world, those things are style. Those are fashion, those are ways of communicating. So we have the Hill. But then DC is, you know, since the 1800s, we became more than just the Hill. And by the 1900s, we really exploded. And so you have the people, the residents of DC, that then begin to create the style. Because now we're really establishing DC as a city, a residential city. And so you have people like, that's when the drag scene actually comes into America, where you had already people, men in dresses or men in women's clothes since antiquity. But this is the first time you're seeing men in women's clothes performing in a non-theatrical space. So William Dorsey Swan, who was a former slave in Hancock, Maryland, in the late 1800s, later freed during Reconstruction, began the first drag balls in America, in DC, with other former enslaved men. And that went on for, I think, about almost 30 years. And the research on him just started. So, and I'm actually not even leading the research, I wish I was, but the research on him just started. And so we're seeing a lot more about him come out. I mean, like, he's been written about in a lot of papers, or like newspapers. And so like they were often arrested and, you know, really going against obviously the moral code of the country by throwing drag balls, and even more so Black, you know, former slaves, men in women's clothes, and not just women's clothes, but also like, this is again the idea about, this is another thing about fashion, especially how we see fashion, which is again from a very Western white perspective. These were Black men in white women's clothes. And so you have this idea of DC already being into a certain degree, a punk city when it comes to fashion. People establishing themselves and saying, this is my identity. Yes, I'm in the nation's capital. Yes, I'm now in this melting pot, but people are establishing their separate identities while living, coexisting in the same space. But I also then go further to the 20th century and I see, you know, like what we were seeing in the civil rights movement. A very big factor about the civil rights movement that was happening, especially in DC, especially if you were within kind of the Martin Luther King, I don't want to say camp, but for lack of a better phrase, and my brain hurts, because I was doing drag earlier today. There was a move to wear your Sunday best whenever you're protesting. So whenever you're looking at their photos, everyone looks amazing. And I've always wondered that too. I was like, why do you look amazing and you're about to like meet these vicious police officers? But the reason is to disarm the public's idea of violent, aggressive Black people and make us look softer and beautiful. That is something that also originated from DC with the Scurlock family. They were a black family. They owned a very famous photography studio. Their photographs are pretty much the 9% of the archives of Black DC. My parents were actually photographed by them for their wedding. But they created the idea of Black beauty and what that would look like, all the way down to what the lighting formula is on how to photograph Black people, not as former slaves, but as freed people who, to a certain degree, if you look at a Scurlock photo, they glow. Mm-hmm. So for a lot, you have this idea of, I think generally in DC, of your style, no matter what it is, needs to establish the way you want to be carried in your respect level. I think that's something that's very much so DC, even down to like the street kids. That's about respect level. You know, what you're wearing, how you wear it, and who you're wearing. And then you go all the way into what I like to think of, and I think people often discount it, but preppy Americana is so prevalent and so real in DC. And, you know, you have other places like Connecticut and Nantucket, but DC does preppy Americana, I think, in my opinion, like no other does it in this country. And it's very much so a lifestyle. It's a way of being. It's a tradition that passes down. So I think that in DC, you have this melting pot of, honestly, fashion traditions that have been heavily overlooked, from punk to the hill to Black designers and Black fashion being very much so a language of the city and being spread out to the rest of the country. So.
Yeah, I like that the last thing that you say, that those tradition or even the fashion that has been overlooked, because I found it very difficult when someone asked me, how do you define fashion in DC? What is fashion in DC? Which I think that conversation, I mean, after that conversation, we understand that it's many different things, many different factors that came in. And at the end of the day, what I understand is basically you can be whoever you want in DC. There is no need to be defined or be, you know, stuck into one box the way we define fashion in New York or fashion in Paris or fashion in London.
I can say, and I didn't say this earlier on the call, but I'm a native Washingtonian. My family has been here for many generations, many, many generations. We have a lot of roots in a lot of different places. And so I grew up with this idea of being clean and put together and, you know, exerting a certain way about yourself. And that has always influenced how I dress. So even in DC, like, I'm literally full tits out wearing a cotton catsuit in front of all of you. But again, this is something I wouldn't just wear at home. I would wear this at 9 a.m. to go get coffee because no one's going to stop you. And in fact, what I've learned about DC is that because so many people fear being outside the box, people really embrace you when you are genuinely outside the box. Mm-hmm. And I think for everyone that we even mentioned, even Nina Hyde, that was a genuine fashion icon. You know, that was like, fashion was not just a thing she did or a thing she wrote about, it was her entire being. You know, Elizabeth Keckley, that was clearly part of her entire being. Like, she was able to interpret the brain, she was able to interpret the brain and how people wanted to carry themselves in a time where fashion wasn't regimented fully just yet. You still had people doing their individual styles with these dresses. As you, Elizabeth, mentioned, people broke dresses up and made them into other things. And so you still have people expressing their individual style. And I don't think that's ever been lost in DC. I just don't think people ever really thought about it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think, I mean, that's kind of a good way to wrap it up between Elizabeth Keckley, between Nina Hyde, the punk scene, the drag queen scene, and the how did you call them? The preppy, the good preppies. I think that yeah, it's a nice salad, and it's actually a very rich. There is a very rich fashion culture in this city that, again, we tend to overlook. So, are there any questions? I did not receive any, so I would imagine that. Well, do you have any questions, Elizabeth, Nancy, Farrah, to one another?
I just wanted to Jason's comment about the preppy, Jeffrey Banks, who I think maybe not a lot of people remember Jeffrey Banks, but he's from DC. Girl.
Yeah,
he's amazing. He's like guest curated things at our exhibition. He's a huge, like, not just designer but a fashion historian. But he's from DC, and he talks about growing up in DC. And like he made preppy. He made it cool. He made it different. But like those are definitely the different colors, the different patterns. Like that was definitely a DC sensibility that he brought up to New York.
Yeah, but
and also
that is from here. You're right. Yeah.
Sorry, but also too, like, you know what I think as well is that, you know, fashion, because I do this on my podcast, like we'll start talking about like a blouse, then we'll talk about the shirtwaist fire, then we'll talk about the economic depression of poor people and poor girls at the time of like 1905. And so I'm about to go there now, but you know, people, it's so interesting too, like the fact that we're talking about Jeffrey Banks and like Elizabeth Keckley and so many African Americans that come out of DC or come to DC. This city is like it had a history of being known as Chocolate City, and not just because it was a bunch of Black people here, because Black people can come and thrive here. Mm-hmm. And so this goes all the way back to Reconstruction, where former slaves, freed people, already freed families that had been freed for a generation or so, were migrating to DC in droves because they could create and actually open up business and their voices would be heard. And so, you know, like, again, it always blows my mind when people are just like, oh, there's no fashion in DC. And I'm just like, there's so much fashion in DC. And, you know, we can't like, but I did have a question for Elizabeth. I wanted to know, I don't know, because this is, again, like it's hard to track one American dressmakers in the 1800s. Like we only have the Victorian dresses, that for a reason. But was there any kind of evidence that talked about Elizabeth Keckley's Black clients, being that the Black upper class was really centered in the country, was centered here?
So I have not come across any kind of mention of her specific Black clients. We know that she made this christening gown for her goddaughter. We can assume that she perhaps made clothes for Black clients or even friends and family. I have not come across that specifically. But you know that I've done some work on African-American dressmakers, mostly in New York, in the 19th century, early-ish 19th century through the late 19th century. And we know that Black dressmakers were making clothes for Black women. Like Black women weren't going to white dressmakers and everyone was going to a dressmaker.
Exactly.
So we know that they were catering to their own communities and that they were creating these dialogues with their clients in these communities. And so I've been trying to unearth kind of more of that. I happen to be kind of focused on New York. I have a book coming out next year called Black Designers in American Fashion. It's an edited volume with many, many amazing scholars. But I wrote a chapter about Black dressmakers in New York in the 19th century. And you can trace them. They put ads in the newspaper where their shops are, and you can follow that migration. Black people were kind of concentrated in the southern tip of Manhattan, and you see them moving up, and you see these dressmakers moving up. So we know that they were creating their communities, catering to their communities. So I would be surprised if she had absolutely no Black clients. I mean, she did have a lot of prestigious white clients, but I have not found anything specifically.
Okay.
Of course. Sorry, Jason.
I'm just blown away that you literally got to do that research. I think that is so, just to be informal, it is so cool. My body is vibrating because I hope you guys get to listen to my podcast. Again, it is very casual conversations about fashion, but very like nerdy intellectual conversations. And, like the kind of thing that you're talking about.
Share it in the chat box.
Oh yes, I should. Because I have to get to, I'm wearing an iPad, so I can't put my hands on the screen, but
and Elizabeth,
share
it. And Elizabeth, please share the news when your book is out.
Yes.
Kelly Lynn is actually asking, any favorite fashion history books or articles?
There is a book, and I'm going to be real with you, I cannot remember the exact title, and I want to say it is called The Creation of Taste. I might be wrong, but it is actually one of my favorite books because it was one of the first like fashion history books I read my first year in college that, thank you, Farrah. You're so sweet. She also saw me every Friday when we would record the episode at the hotel, so she knows it very well. But this, I will find it, and I will actually, you know what, when I find it, I'll send it to you in an email. Joelle, if you can like send it out somehow, or we can even post it on the Tribute like Instagram. But it's a really great book because it really put history into context for me. It's called like The Creation of Taste, the first latte, the first hairdresser, and the first fashion designer. And it talks about in Europe how the first kind of celebrity trends really started. And we're going all the way back, I want to say, to the 1600s. And so you get like the first expensive latte in Italy, and then like, Marie Antoinette's hairdresser being like the first like actual celebrity hairdresser, and so on and so forth. But it put history in a context for me that made history real again. It made the people real. And I think that's something that people often miss when trying to read history or trying to decipher it and trying to understand it, is that these were real people. They sweat and they have anxiety just like you did. No, they did not wash all the time, but nonetheless. But it taught me a lesson I love about history that I always say is that, and forgive my French, everyone, but I'm just gonna be very casual, but the thing I always say about history is same shit, different clothes. It's like we never learn the lessons, but the clothes always evolve. And that's the great thing about fashion history. So I'll try to find that book for sure though, because it's one of my favorites.
Thank you. Any other favorite books or articles? I shared the article that Elizabeth wrote.
Right now, one of my favorite books is called Chinatown Pretty. It's a collection of senior folks in various Chinatowns across the world, just wearing whatever the heck they feel like. I flipped through this book today. I saw it at a store in New Union Market for the first time. And I said, like, all of these Chinese grandmas are more fashionable than me because they just wear whatever the hell they want to wear and they do not care what you think of them. And the confidence that comes with like the power clashing of this is incredible. So that's a new one I think that just came out again. I hadn't seen it before these past couple months, and today was the first time I actually had my hands on it to flip through, but it is incredible. And I think I'm like, oh, this is what I would like to look like in my old age. So it's personal for me.
One of my favorite books, to go back to Jason's point about kind of making history real, there's a book about Marie Antoinette called Queen of Fashion by Caroline Weber. And it's very heavy on history, but she has a really great style and tone, and it talks about her clothes. And, Rose Bertin, her stylist, and her hairdresser, and all of that coming together. But it's a really fun book if you like that period, but it gives you the history in a fun way, but also focuses pretty deeply on fashion. So that's one I go back to a lot.
Kelly, Lynn, we have a fashion library at Tribute if you want any book, and we have actually The Queen of Fashion by Caroline Weber. So you can come in, you know where to find us, and we have a whole list of, we have like 100 and now 120 books. We're still building it, but hopefully we'll make it available for all the universities around the DMV so they can learn more about fashion and fashion history and fashion culture. Anyone else? I think that's it for the good chat today. If you have any questions or any follow-up questions, just email them to me at info@thisistribute.com. You can tune in for more chat on our YouTube page or go on our website to the Good Chats and you'll have more information there. I want to thank again Elizabeth, Nancy, Jason, and Farrah. I'm so grateful that you took the time to join us today. I've learned a lot and I'm super appreciative. And I thank you all for logging in and for being part of that virtual conversation.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.